You're listening to the Today's Family Lawyer podcast, the leading source of daily news and insight for family law practitioners in England and Wales. Sign up to our free weekly newsletter at todaysfamilylawyer.co.uk and subscribe to hear all the latest news and views from across the family law sector. You can also follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter.
Hello and welcome along to the latest Today's Family Lawyer podcast. I'm delighted this week to be joined by James Brown. James is not a singer, although I suspect you probably get asked that a lot. He's the managing partner and co-owner of Hall Brown Family Law, based in Manchester, I think, James, is that right?
Yeah, we've got offices here, Leeds, Sheffield and London, but I'm currently sitting in Manchester.
And that's one of the things that I'd really like to talk to you about today is some of that growth and expansion that you've enjoyed, because since you launched in 2016, I think it's fair to say that Hall Brown has been a pretty good success story, particularly for the Northwest. And so the discussion today is really about the mechanics of setting up, launching a family law firm, and also looking into how you've really made the business a success over the last 6 or 7 years. So thank you very much indeed for joining the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Well, we'll start there. Tell us a little bit about yourself in the first instance, please, James. That's probably a good place to start.
Okay, so like kind of so many people, I did the relatively standard trajectory of degree, followed by I did the GDL or PGDL as it was then at the College of Law, now the University of Law, and was lucky enough to get a training contract at Manchester, which is now Pennington's Manchester. They had a huge family team. I did a seat in family and absolutely loved it. And it sort of helped at the time that they were the number one for family in London. I mean, I won't get into the fact that I'm sure as a northern boy, I was seen as some sort of novelty, but who cares, right? It worked for me. So I really enjoyed it. I was lucky enough to work for a lady called Jane Simpson, who was the kind of head of the family team at the time and work on some great cases. My wife and I got married. We decided we wanted to start a family and didn't really want to do it in London. So we relocated back home to Manchester, which is where I am from. I transitioned to what was then the kind of number one family team in Manchester, which was Pennoni. From there, I exited with a lady called Beth Wilkins, one of the kind of senior family lawyers in the Northwest, to go to JMW, which is where I met Sam, the hall in Hall Brown. And we were at JMW from 11 to 16, took the team from, up to tier 1 in the rankings, if that's what's important to people, and had been talking for a while about setting up. And in 2016, we decided to branch out and set up on our own.
What was prompted that decision? Because it's a big move to go, particularly in Manchester, and to go from a big firm like JMW as well.
Yes, so I think a whole raft of things, right? So Sam and I had always talked about it. Wouldn't it be great to have our own firm? And usually after a kind of few beers, it was always, we're definitely going to do it tomorrow. And of course, then, the reality kicked in. So his first thing is we'd always been kind of interested in doing it. Second, one of the trainees at Manch's father was Douglas Alexu, and he had started Alexu Fisher Phillips back in, I think, the 90s. And of course, in London, teams breaking away to set up true kind of boutiques that only did family had been happening in, during the course of the 90s. But it hadn't really been done in Manchester. So we'd sort of said, look, I definitely think there's a potential need for it. I think there's definitely a market. And I think generally that is the direction of travel for the legal industry. Anyway, gone are the days where people would go to one firm as a one-stop shop. I think clients have become much better at shopping around and they want proper specialists. And that's especially the case when you work in a discipline like ours, where I think just under 90% of our clients are all recommendations from existing or former clients. So it's done solely on referrals. And therefore, if that's your business and that's where your work is coming from, we thought we could build a business that catered better to that than the sort of one-size-fits-all approach to clients that you inevitably have to have at a full-service law firm. So we'd always talked about it. We'd seen that it happened in London and thought it would work in Manchester. But then there were other just general practicalities. Sam and I don't spend any money, so we had savings. And we sort of said, look, if we burn through this and we've not made it work, then we'll have given it a good shot. But we had those savings ready to go. But most importantly, my wife and his partner both had jobs that could meet our outgoings as families. So we didn't have to, we will talk about bravery or taking a gamble. Actually, for us, it wasn't a gamble in the way that for lots of people it would. So, the kind of stars just aligned, and it came to a point where either we were going to have to buy in at the firm we were in to become equity, or we could use that money to go it alone. And we were stupid enough to go it alone, and that's what we did.
It doesn't look from my side of the table that it was a stupid decision. Hall Brown is now a very, very well respected firm, and in February this year was named as one of the best small companies to work for. You've also now got a staff roster of just under 60.
That's right, yeah.
One of the really interesting things that you said in that introduction is you've described Hall Brown as a business. There aren't many lawyers, dare I say, that would describe their firms as a business, and perhaps that's partly where you've had some of your success.
Yeah, I think potentially. So weirdly, lots of lawyers are very, very conscious of the bottom line, right? And we are an incredibly simple business to run, law firms generally. If your fee income that you are generating is greater than your overheads, then you will make a profit. We don't have to deal with supply chain. We don't have to deal with machinery breaking, for example. We don't have to rent multiple different places for storage, warehousing, etc. So actually, in that sense, professional services and specifically law firms, they're not complicated businesses. What we found slightly surprising, and we've tried to, I'd say, do differently, but I'm not sure we're that different to most businesses. I think we're behind the curve in terms of what we do for the team compared to lots of businesses, but ahead of the curve in terms of what law firms do for their teams, if that makes sense. I think the main difference is they can be very conscious of the fees coming in and the bottom line, but I think what can get lost is the fact that actually the only thing you have to sell are brains and people. That's it. So if you don't keep your people happy, then you don't have a firm and you don't have a business. They could be great lawyers, but if you don't look after them and they're unhappy, you haven't got a business. And if you think about this practically, your lawyers are your salespeople. They are your manufacturing line, because they're the ones who are actually generating the work which bills for it. They are your supply chain. They are your marketing team. They are also your accounts team, because actually they're the people best placed to ensure that the work they do, gets paid. Gets paid for. So you sit and you say, well, hang on a second. If I was a manufacturer and I said there's a risk that my entire manufacturing line or a line in my manufacturing plant is going to leave, but don't worry, because in 3 to 6 months I can recruit another manufacturing line, people would say you are absolutely crazy. And yet that's the kind of approach that people seem to have to lawyers within law firms. So I think when we talk about it as a business, I don't think of it as a business in terms of just focusing on the pounds, shillings and pence, because I think every law firm does that. But where I think we do try and do it is we say, well, imagine this wasn't a law firm. What is it that our people, our lawyers and our support team for those people are actually producing? And then it is, right, well, how can we ensure that those people are happy and, more importantly, don't leave?
Well, hold that thought, because we're going to come back to that. But take me back to 2016. You've just launched. It's you and Sam. What did day one look like? What did week one look like?
So we were fortunate in that our previous firm had been very sensible about which clients were going to follow us and which weren't. The funny thing about family is, in a sense, restrictive covenants can be a bit pointless. Because if you're acting for, a very high net worth individual, or you're acting for a footballer or a footballer's wife or whatever it might be, they don't care about the fact that there is a restrictive covenant, right? They care about the fact that they came to you on a personal recommendation. You're now moving to your own firm or another firm, and they will follow you. So therefore, enforcing those restrictive covenants is quite difficult. And actually, the firm we were at, was sensible. They saw that. So it meant that we had some cases that, were going to generate revenue. So call that problem number one kind of dealt with and ticked off, right? But there is no question that those early weeks were absolutely full on, because you're learning to an extent how you go, compliance with the SRA accounts rules, dealing with a landlord who said one thing and has done another, We had mice at one stage in our, serviced office. There was the practicality of physically getting the files, because this is pre-paperless, right? Physically getting the files from our old firm to our, tiny office. And of course, you're trying to do a really good job for your clients. And as work spun up, trying to recruit. So it was, chaos. It just perhaps a bit like sausages, right? No one wants to see how they're made. As long as the sausage tastes delicious and is relatively presentable at the end, then you're fine. But the problem is with all these things is you look back with rose-tinted spectacles, because of course it worked. I think if what we did do for those first, year to 18 months is we were working incredibly long hours. You had to be willing to do everything. You might be in court and then walking to pick up the DX. Afterwards, you're making the hot drinks, you're not delegating it out. But it was brilliant fun, because once we saw that clients were going to land and they were going to actually be prepared to pay their bills because of the standard of work you were doing, it was this most amazing feeling, because I'd literally started with 2 post-it notes setting out what we wanted to be internally, what we wanted to be to the marketplace. And all of a sudden, there was an actual firm that actually generated revenue. And that was the best feeling in the world.
So dare I ask, what did those 2 post-it notes say?
So this is going to sound quite negative about the previous firms we were at, but it's not a reflection on them, right? Because they've got to run their businesses in a certain way. They've got to run their firms in a certain way. But a lot of our list was what we weren't going to do as opposed to what we were going to do. Does that make sense? So internally, we said, right, number 1, no targets for lawyers. I think that's absolutely pointless, particularly with what we do. So we said no targets. We said we only wanted to recruit the best lawyers, is what the note says, but really what that means is people who've worked in the sort of top tier firms, not because that's some sort of snob factor, but because we wanted to be able to offer the clients certainty that whoever you're talking to, they know what they're doing. But also internally, lots of lawyers, this conception that all lawyers want to be is rich and all they want to do is make money is actually, we think is wrong. Actually, most lawyers just want to be really, really good at their job, whether it's because they're competitive and they're a type A person, or whether it's because they actually, God forbid, really enjoy what they do. But actually, they want to be really good at their job. And actually, one of the best ways to help them be the best at what they do is also surround them with the other best lawyers, so that they are all learning from each other and benefiting from each other's knowledge. So we said no targets, only recruit the best lawyers. We wanted to create a culture that was kind of non-hierarchical. Law firms love hierarchy, and lawyers are really old-fashioned. There is a firm who will remain nameless where when you become partner, you get a different coloured bin. That is a true story, and it's remarkable how strongly people feel about getting their different coloured bin, right? It's still the case where partners are in offices and others are out on the floor. So what we said is, no, hang on a second, that can't be the best way of doing it. And actually loads of other businesses have moved away from that. So, we're open plan. We all have the same equipment. If we win an award, everyone is invited as opposed to a handful of partners, because, any award is only the result of the team effort. So that kind of sanding away some of the hierarchy was a big thing for us. The 4th thing was communication and openness. So one of the things that used to wind us up is the fact that, for example, someone could end up joining the team and no one had asked you about it. And it's not that you'd have necessarily stopped it, but you kind of at least talk to us about it, at least explain what the rationale is. So we, for example, we have an anonymous right of veto. So if we want to recruit someone and we've met them, we explain to the candidate how the right of veto works, and then Sam and I will effectively pitch to the firm. And we will say, look, we've met this person. We think they're great because of X, Y, and Z. This is what we think they can offer. And anyone working in their office, so if it's a Sheffield person, the Sheffield office, if it's a Manchester person, the Manchester office, has an anonymous right of veto. They can prevent that person from joining as long as there's a decent commercial reason why. And then everyone else in the firm is invited to give feedback. And it's brilliant because, you sometimes find out things that you didn't know. So, for instance, there was a female partner who had a cracking practice, but it turns out she was very unpleasant to the support team. And we wouldn't have known that had we not asked anyone. And actually a relative of one of our support team had worked for her historically and had shared this and said, look, I'm not going to use my veto, but you need to be aware of this. And actually we didn't recruit her as a result. Well, we'd have never known that. And it would have been too late once she landed. But it also keeps us honest, because it's very difficult for us to recruit someone unless you're also communicating why, what are you trying to achieve with the firm, how will they slot in, how will that help you achieve, your objectives, etc. But most importantly, if you're a new starter and you know that every single person in the firm wants you to be there, that's a great feeling, because it means you're arriving and you know, I'm supposed to be here. No one's got a problem with me. So and then finally, finishing off, the other thing is we try and remunerate competitively or better than the market, and then proper attention to health. So mental health specifically. So for instance, we have a psychologist who's on 24-hour retainer on a completely anonymous basis. Our team can meet her or ring her, and all we get is a bill at the end of it. So rather than sitting and saying, no, mental health's really important, we sit and go, well, actually, what does that really mean? How can we properly support staff? Because the job we're doing sometimes is horrible. You're dealing with really upsetting issues, or you've got stuff going on in your own private life that you need support with, such that you can't also support your clients. So that's a way of doing it. And then the kind of standards, flexible working, etc., and a commitment to CSR, but not just talking about it.
I think a commitment to flexible working as a bit of a throwaway, James, is still so much more than a lot of firms do. And there's a whole load of questions that have come out of what you said there. I'm going to start with the on-call psychologist, because we've recently done a podcast in the wills and probate arena where we've gone through all of those challenges that a lawyer faces. And it's so difficult not to take some of that home with you, particularly, as you say, when you're dealing with such challenging cases.
Completely. I think if there's anyone who is a business owner or a team leader who is querying the benefits of it, it is just kind of the right thing to do, in inverted commas, but it's also commercially the right thing to do. Because if there isn't an appropriate level of mental health support and one of your fee earners falls off the cliff because they are poorly, then that is disastrous, not only in terms of your kind of fee income, but also the service to clients and also the knock-on impact it can have on those around them. The whole point of intervention in the form of, an early intervention by encouraging them to talk to people is, this individual is able to say, do you know what, this person is heading to be really poorly for whatever reason, a parent has died, or they've broken up with their partner, or one of their cases has been a trigger for whatever reason. You can remove them from that case and or be giving them some annual leave, for example, to make a speedy recovery, rather than it just carrying on and then it properly impacting on their health long term. There are others that the issue for them may just be workload, stress, and what they need are coping techniques, for example. Well, I'm not trained to provide that. All I can sit is say, well, when I was your age, I had massive targets, blah, 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 blah. There's a real danger of that, I think, if you're senior. But an actual trained psychologist could probably help them understand what the challenges are and then give them coping techniques to help them manage it, which makes happier team, but also more productive.
Let me drill into recruitment a little bit further, because you've described how you try and recruit the creme de la creme, the best of the best. That brings with it a whole load of personalities. How do you deal with the inevitable clashes?
I think we've been relatively fortunate in that we've sort of avoided any major conflict thus far. But
touch wood.
Yeah, touch wood. And also, we're only 6 years old, right? So yes, you'd sit and go, wow, you've been going for 6 years. But I would sit and say, there's firms out there that are 30, 50. Look at Farris, they're like 2,000 years old or whatever, right? So a lot of what I'm saying is very much, look, it's working for us now. You and I may talk again in 5 years and me go, my God, it turns out a lot of those things, turns out long term, they were an absolute disaster. So, and similarly, we've kind of avoided conflict. Now, I think that is a combination of being incredibly blunt with people before they start in terms of the reality of the place and the culture. I think the right of veto is absolutely brilliant for that, because it filters out look, this person is a great lawyer, but they are not going to fit in with the culture for X, Y, and Z reasons. Even asking someone themselves and explaining the right of veto culture, if they've got a problem with me going to the firm and saying, if they don't trust the fact that 60 people in the firm are not going to leak the fact that we're in discussions with them, and they say they're uncomfortable with the right of veto, then that's a great filter, because they never would have been right in the first place. And I think the final thing is, we just don't take it that seriously. And I don't mean the job, the law and acting for clients, we take incredibly seriously. But in terms of like how we communicate internally and the hierarchy or whatever, I think people can take themselves, I'm not a heart surgeon, right? We're not, and similarly at the other end of the spectrum, we're not going down a mine. So I think the fact that, we try and have it just, look, don't take yourself too seriously, either filters them out because they like to be taken very seriously, or they very quickly realise that it's an absolute waste of time expecting to be treated in a certain way.
You touched on training as well, and the pandemic has clearly had a massive impact on law firm culture. Let me ask you about this whole learning by osmosis piece, though, because a lot of law firms have embraced flexible working, but a lot of law firms have made it very clear that they want their staff back in the office because of that, call it traditional view, that being sat with the partner or being sat with somebody more senior will enable you to learn more effectively.
Yeah, and I think that's been a massive tension. And I think that we and kind of all the other people I would talk to who are running teams or firms or whatever, I think we're all still just feeling our way through it. Because I don't think the pandemic just impacted on learning by osmosis. I think it fundamentally changed the expectation of lawyers as to what they are in, the entitlement to flexibility. So, you push people to come back at your peril. But if you allow everyone to work from home, you may find that the problem of not learning by osmosis isn't a problem now, but it'll be a problem in 2 years' time, by which it's too late. Because trying to work out backwards, well, what did we learn by osmosis and what did we learn formally is impossible. So the gaps that some of your junior team members might have due to learning by osmosis, it'll be almost too late when you find out where they've come about. So kind of how have we dealt with that, I think, is probably where this question is going, right? So number one, I think if you've got a general culture of flexibility, it also means you can have a relatively blunt and brutal conversation as a group about what your expectations are and what your concerns are. If you've never had flexibility before, then demanding people to return to the office, but saying it's as a result of learning and for their benefit, even if that's true, is not going to be believable. So I think we were relatively lucky that because we were flexible in the first place, and don't forget, we were a brand new firm, right? A lot of these things we had to make ourselves more attractive to get people to roll the dice with us in the first place, right? The second thing is, at the time we started, I had 2 very young children. And people can talk about flexible working, but if the bosses are sitting there from 6 a.m. until 10 p.m., that's the culture, right? But because I've got 2 young children and I do the school drop-off, I don't land at my desk until 9:45. I'll never miss a sports day, I'll never miss a school concert, and I say the same to the team and make sure that they don't, because I think if they see that you are living it, then that's much more believable. But so going into it, they saw that we were serious about flexibility, all fine. What we then did is, coming out of it, we effectively did a questionnaire on almost a rolling 12-week basis, anonymous questionnaire, as to what people felt would be the right way of balancing it. Now, where we've netted out as a result of those questionnaires is a 3 in, 2 out, but for everyone, because you can't insist that a paralegal comes in more when there's no partners there, because that's pointless. The whole idea that they're coming in. And then what we've tried to do is put more formal training structures in place alongside that. So you've got less osmosis. We've tried to put more formal training in place. But as I say, I don't think we'll know whether that's right for another year, maybe 2 years. And those who let people work at home may be proved right and say, look, people are really happy because they're working at home and there were no problems. And the people who were 5 days, maybe the people patting themselves on the back and saying, look, I told you we needed to drag people back in. So that's where we're at the moment. But I think that's evolving. I think, and anyone who says they've got the answer is lying.
We're fast running out of time, but I'd really like to talk to you about one of the things that you talked about right at the start of the podcast, which was your commitment to corporate social responsibility, because it was one of the tenets of setting up Hall Brown.
Yeah.
How do you feel that benefits the firm and the staff and the culture?
In terms of kind of backstory, we touched on the fact that Sam and I had kind of some capital that we were able to use to set up the firm in the first place. One of the reasons for that is neither is that driven by money. It didn't really form any part of our rationale when we decided to set up on our own. So to then find ourselves sitting on this sort of really commercially successful firm was a bit embarrassing, if that makes sense. It's great and it's a privilege and an honour, and obviously I would much prefer that than the other way. But there's a sort of element, I don't know, kind of an element of guilt associated with that, because that was never really our kind of plan. So firstly, it helps salve our conscience. Second, I genuinely believe that people now want to work for organisations that pay them well, that look after them, but also take their kind of wider role in society seriously. So it salves our conscience, but it's also a really effective recruitment and retention tool. Lots and lots of businesses talk about it, right? And what they actually mean in real life is that a handful of people might do a 10K, every year and raise a bit of money, and look at that, aren't we great? And we were kind of like, right, well, look, if we're going to do this, let's do it properly. In the same way that when we set up the firm, we were saying, look, we're going to do it. We need to be pitching for tier 1. We need to be aiming to recruit the best lawyers, etc. And we'd cast around sort of for a project that we could properly invest in and put our skills and energy into. One of the things we looked at was a legal advice centre. But around the same time, it came up that the Family Drug and Alcohol Court was about to be closed because the government had pulled their funding. And we knew, as family lawyers, the value that the Family Drug and Alcohol Court had. B, if the Family Drug and Alcohol Court took off, it would be a much better use of court resources, which in turn would benefit our clients dealing with the private law side of things in the court system. 3, we were pretty confident that using our kind of PR person or whatever it might be, that we could kind of raise the profile of it and raise some money. And then finally, if the family lawyers weren't willing to pay for it, we had a client bank of rich people who may or may not have had direct experience of the sort of challenges that people at the Family Drug and Alcohol Court were dealing with, who we knew would put their hands in their pockets. So that did relatively well. We raised just under kind of 300 grand. We kept it open. The government has now brought back the funding as a result. So all of that kind of went well. But the beauty of it internally was the fact that, this team knew they weren't just generating revenue for 2, sales guys with law degrees in the form of myself and Sam, right? That actually the revenue that they were generating was also properly being put to good use. And, I would, again, if anyone's listening to this and is interested in what I've got to say, I would absolutely urge them to find something and then try and do it properly if they're going to do it at all with CSR.
The discussion's been a bit of a trip around some of the background to your own experience of setting up Hall Brown and some of your own experiences of creating a really positive culture. And as you say, perhaps if we speak again in 5 years, it might have been the wrong thing, but certainly seems to be working for you right now, James. We're out of time. It's been fantastic to have you on the podcast, and I really appreciate you joining. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me, David.
The Today's Family Lawyer podcast is available on your preferred podcast provider. It's also available on todaysfamilylawyer.co.uk. My thanks to James. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you again soon.
You're listening to the Today's Family Lawyer podcast, the leading source of daily news and insight for family law practitioners in England and Wales. Sign up to our free weekly newsletter at todaysfamilylawyer.co.uk and subscribe to hear all the latest news and views from across the family law sector. You can also follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter.